Good afternoon, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. This is Rich again, back for your second video blog of the day for Friday, April 3rd, 2015, around 5:23 p.m. in Billerica, Massachusetts. Been a cloudy day. Highs probably reached about 58 or so. We didn't get 70 degrees outside. If the sun pokes out for anytime soon, we could reach 70. Some news to report. San Francisco Giants have re-signed their manager Bruce Bochy to a contract extension through 2019 season. Bruce Bochy has won 3 world championships with the Giants as managers. And also, they promoted the general manager Brian Sabian to become a general vice president of baseball operations. So, good luck to Sabian, who deserved a promotion. And Minnesota Twins pitcher Irvin Santana has been suspended by Major League Baseball 80 games for testing PED. Not good. He's going to miss half the season. That's about it on the news. My next subject, continuation series on regional professional wrestling territories back in the day. I'm going to be talking about Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, which was run by Jim Crockett Promotions. Jim Crockett Sr., Jim Crockett Jr., and David Crockett ran Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling from 1931 through 1988. And Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling was the most prominent NWA territory in the 1980s. And it's known for the Nature Boy, Ric Flair, and the Four Horsemen, and Dusty Rhodes, and others. And Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling started the wrestling supercards shows like Starrcade and the Great American Bash. The story of Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, it started out in 1931 promoting cards in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia and Western Virginia. They went as far as Washington, D.C. to promote cards, and they went far as south as South Carolina. And the main arena was the Greensboro Coliseum. And it was basically a tag team territory for many years. Maybe the first 30 years it was in existence. It was known more as a tag team wrestling territory than a singles territory. Jim Crockett Sr. got membership to the Mid-Atlantic, for the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling to the NWA in 1952, and usually the traveling NWA World Champion would come to Greensboro once in a while to defend the titles. But the Jim Crockett Sr. did not have he wasn't really pushing for a wrestler from his territory to be NWA World Champion, because they were a tag team territory for years. And like some of the tag teams they had were Rip Park and Swede Hansen, and the great Scots, George Scott and his brother Sandy Scott. Plus they had some other talent like Johnny Valentine and Wahoo McDaniels and Mr. One Paul Jones through the 70s and stuff. Plus, the major titles for the Mid-Atlantic region was the Mid-Atlantic Television title, the Mid-Atlantic U.S. title, the Mid-Atlantic Championship, and the NWA Mid-Atlantic Tag Team Championships. And they had syndicated programming, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, which was hosted by Bob Cotto, and it was taped at a television studio. And they had Wide World Wrestling, also known as Worldwide Wrestling, known with Rick Lambert and David Crockett, and that was syndicated throughout the Mid-Atlantic territory and stuff. And Mid-Atlantic by the mid-70s got some great wrestling talent. Nature Boy Ric Flair, and they had Greg the Hammer Valentine, and they had Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, Blackjack Mulligan, Big John Studd, Ken Patera, the Big Cat Ernie Ladd, Jack Briscoe, and they had the Iron Sheik, Mr. USA Tony Atlas, Paul Mr. Wonderful Orange, Jimmy Superfly Snuka, Baron Von Raschke, and Ivan Koloff came in. And Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling was becoming the hottest regional wrestling promotion next to the Worldwide Wrestling Federation in all of the United States regional territories. and they had a lot of talent exchanges between Mid-Atlantic and the WWF, changing up. Once in a while, Andre the Giant would come down and headline Greensboro, North Carolina shows at the Greensboro Coliseum. Plus, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling had working relationships with Championship Wrestling from Florida and a few other regional territories. And surely but surely, Jim Crockett Jr. was pushing and pushing for Nature Boy Ric Flair to become the NWA World Champion. But every year, his push would get derailed, and Jim Crockett Jr. was getting furious because he wanted Ric Flair as NWA World Champion so bad, or he was going to drop out of the NWA. And finally, in 1981, it became down to Ric Flair and Ted DiBiase, and Vince McMahon Sr. was on the board of directors of the NWA, and he casted the final vote, and he picked Nature Boy Ric Flair as NWA World Champion. And on September 17th, 1981, Nature Boy Ric Flair became the NWA World Champion, beating Dusty Rhodes, the American Dream, and becoming the NWA World Champion. This got Jim Crockett a lot of power within the NWA. He became probably the most powerful promoter in the NWA, becoming NWA president for most of the 1980s. Plus, in addition, around this time, NWA Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling was getting more talent, like Sergeant Slaughter, Cowboy Bob Orton, Rowdy Piper, Jake the Snake Roberts. They were getting Jerry Briscoe. They were getting Jay Youngblood, and they were getting more and more talent. They had some classic matches with Steamboat and Youngblood against Slaughter and Don Cornell, the final conflict for the NWA Mid-Atlantic Tag Team Championships. Also, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat and Jay Youngblood had a famous feud with the Briscoes, Jack and Jerry Briscoe, and stuff like that. And they were promoting this all over the country. Plus, in addition, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling was starting to expand in this time frame. They were going to the Baltimore Arena in Baltimore, Maryland, hence invading the WWF territory. Then they went to Philadelphia Civic Center, and they usually the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling cards out to the WWF at Spectrum. Amazing. Then they Pittsburgh, and they promoted in Ohio, and then they started promoting in Canada, Toronto, Canada, at Maple Leafs Gardens with Frank Tunney. And also they went into Knoxville, Tennessee area, invading Southeastern Championship Wrestling territory. And by 1983, Jim Crockett Jr. started promoting more and more, and he moved TV tapings of Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling and Worldwide Wrestling from TV studios to small arenas in the southeast part of his territory in North and South Carolina. And Jim Crockett Jr. decided he wanted a wrestling supercard, and he promoted Starrcade 83 on Thanksgiving night 1983. It was a Flair for a gold, Starrcade 83. The main event was Ric Flair, the Nature Boy, facing off against seven-time NWA World Champion Harley Race for the NWA World title in a steel cage match. And this was a big supercard, and Ric Flair won that title in a steel cage. Also on the supercard were Greg the Hammer Valentine against Rowdy Piper in a dog collar match. Piper won the dog collar match. The NWA World title, the NWA US title was not on the line. And also Jack and Jerry Briscoe faced off against Ricky Steamboat and Jay Youngblood for the NWA World Tag Team titles. Special referee was Angelo Mosca. And they also had Carlos Colon against Abdullah the Butcher. Among others, they had some wrestlers from Championship Wrestling from Florida on this card, and they had WWC, which was Colon and Abdullah the Butcher. And this Starrcade 83 was very successful. Was the most successful supercard. Gordon Soley and Bob Carter called this one, and it was awesome. And by 1984, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling lost some talent Piper and Greg the Hammer Valentine and Cowboy Bob Orton went to the WWF for their national expansion. But to counter that, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling signed the American Dream Dusty Rhodes as talent and booker, plus eventually Dusty brought along with him manager J.J. Dillon as his co-booker and also a manager, and also they got like Tully Blanchard as a talent, they got Magnum TA, and they got a few others. By 1985, they had another Starrcade in 1984, November 1984, which was a little disappointment than 1983, but it got more successful. And by 1985, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat left Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling for the WWF, but Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling was continued to expand. Their syndicated programs were now seen coast to coast in the United States. In April of 1985, the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling bought out Ole Anderson's Championship Wrestling from Georgia, and they got the 6:05 p.m. time slot on WTBS. They bought it from $1 million from Vince McMahon, who owned the WWE. Vince McMahon used that $1 million to fund the first WrestleMania. That's amazing. And then Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling was on the Superstation TBS that was throughout the United States, and Jim Crockett Jr. continued to get more power in the NWA and stuff. He was becoming the probably the best, most successful, most powerful promoter in the NWA, continued to gain renewing his presidency. Also, the NWA, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling signed Nikita Koloff and the Road Warriors and Midnight Express and the Rock and Roll Express. And then in the summer of 1985, they had a wrestling tour throughout the Mid-Atlantic called the Great American Bash, which was in arenas and also baseball stadiums in the Mid-Atlantic territory and stuff. And Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling was continuing to grow and stuff, and Dusty Rhodes was becoming more popular than ever before. He was booking himself a lot on television. He had a feud with Nature Boy Ric Flair over the NWA World title, which came to a head at Starrcade 85, which they had it at the Greensboro Coliseum in Atlanta, Georgia. It was a dual show, and it was Dusty Rhodes beating Nature Boy Ric Flair for the NWA World title, but with a Dusty finisher, which Dusty won, but it got reversed on television next week because the original referee got knocked out, and the second referee declares Dusty the winner by pinfall, but the first referee gets up and then voids the victory, and that Dusty finisher was not that good. It eventually led to the downfall of Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling and Jim Crockett Promotions, but that's another story that's going to be covered a little later on in this video blog. By 1986, Jim Crockett became very, very powerful in the NWA. He exclusively booked Ric Flair to his Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling territory. He did not farm Ric Flair out to any other NWA affiliated territory, not World Class Championship Wrestling in Texas or St. Louis or Portland, Oregon, the Don Owens territory, or Championship Wrestling from Florida or other NWA affiliated territories, which, Jim Crockett just wanted Ric Flair to himself, and he got more powerful. And also around this time as well, the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling's name was being phased out on television. They were starting to call themselves the NWA or Jim Crockett Promotions, but the NWA is not really it's a national territory. It's not really a regional territory. It's a national wrestling organization, which a lot of the regional territories used it for its name. So technically, they were NWA, but they were still, in my opinion, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling or Jim Crockett Promotions. And also in 1986 was a very successful year with Jim Crockett Promotions, because they were going into new markets and stuff. They were promoting basically all over the eastern United States. They were going into New York, New Jersey. They couldn't promote at have a card in Madison Square Garden, because that was Vince McMahon had exclusive territories for Madison Square Garden, so they were promoting in Nassau Coliseum and the Meadowlands. They were being successful, and then they went to Boston, and they weren't as very successful. And they had continuing to have great talent. Four Horsemen were formed, which was Ric Flair, Ole Leonard Anderson, and Tully Blanchard. And they had the four, and they were managed by J.J. Gillin. Magnum TA had a feud with Nikita Koloff over the United States title. They had the Rock and Roll Express face off against the Midnight Express for the NWA World Championship throughout the summer at the Great American Bash. They had the Boogie Woogie Man, Jimmy Valiant, face and Paul Jones feuding in his army. That was like over 2 years, that feud with the Boogie Woogie Man and Mr. One Paul Jones and his army. It was like Stone Cold Steve Austin and Vince McMahon feud in the WWE, not as successful, but it was a mid-card feud. And Dusty Rhodes actually won the NWA World Championship in July of 1986, but lost it to Ric Flair around 3 weeks later. And the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, or Jim Crockett Promotions, or the NWA were reaching at its peak in around the summer of 1986. But afterwards, there were a lot of things going behind the scenes in Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, Jim Crockett Promotions, that was going to lead to its downfall. First, in October of 1986, Magnum TA, who was being positioned himself as the number one babyface in Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, suffered a near-fatal car accident, and he was groomed to become the next NWA World Champion. And that was a kind of a blow. The Booker Dusty Rhodes had to put Nikita Koloff from a heel to a face and face off against Ric Flair for the NWA World Championship at Starrcade 86. That didn't turn out too good. Nikita was better as a heel. And also around this time, Jim Crockett bought the dying Central States territory, and also buying the dying St. Louis territory, which Harley Race owned a portion of it. But once Harley Race went to the WWF in around 1986 as the King, Harley Race, that territory went downhill, and that was losing money. Why would Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, Jim Crockett Promotions, buy a dying territory and stuff like that? It acquired a lot of debt. And then in the winter of 1987, Jim Crockett Promotions, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, bought the dying Championship Wrestling from Florida territory in Tampa, Florida. Championship Wrestling from Florida was going downhill ever since Dusty Rhodes left there in 1984, and owners Eddie Graham committed suicide in January of 1985. That territory was dying, and why would Jim Crockett buy a dying promotion? He probably wanted talent, plus in addition, and television. Plus, he didn't want Vince McMahon to buy those territories. I bet Vince McMahon was not interested in buying Championship Wrestling for Florida or Central States or the St. Louis territory. Period. He wasn't interested in buying them. That acquired a lot of debt for Jim Crockett Promotions. But the biggest thing that Jim Crockett Promotions Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling did to acquire even more debt was to buy the Universal Wrestling Federation Mid-South. It was Mid-South Wrestling before, from Bill Watts in the spring of 1987, which Bill Watts had a lot of television contracts and a lot of great talent, and he in a big office in Dallas, Texas, and Jim Crockett acquired UWF, and he actually moved his operations from Charlotte, North Carolina to Dallas, Texas, which David Crockett did not really like, because Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling was based out of Charlotte, North Carolina, but Jim Crockett was more powerful than his brother David Crockett. He had to go along with it or he would have been out of a job. And also more and more Dusty Rhodes with his booking and stuff, putting himself over or doing something or just on television a lot. But the NWA got some, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling got some good talent around this time. Barry Windham, Mike Rotundo, Lex Luger were being pushed pretty good. But the biggest thing, they botched. They had a missed opportunity with the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling at this time period, how to handle the UWF merger. They could have had a big invasion angle with the UWF, because they had some great talent like Dr. Death Steve Williams, Terry Taylor, Eddie Gilbert, Dick Murdoch, the One Man Gang, Big Bubba, Sting, Rick Steiner, a few others. But Jim Crockett Promotions treated the UWF as a second-rate promotion. They could have had a big angle over this, but they treated it like a second-rate promotion. Plus, in addition, Jim Crockett Promotions, or Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, was continuing to run Central States and Championship Wrestling from Florida, but the talent pool wasn't that great, so they had to use second-rate Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling wrestlers to fold the cards, and fans weren't buying it. Jim Crockett was not going to send Ric Flair or Arn Anderson or Tully Blanchard or Dusty Rhodes or the Rock and Roll Express or the Midnight Express to Championship Wrestling from Florida or Central States to help him out. They were leaving those territories to probably die. They did eventually. They were eventually folded up into Jim Crockett Promotions Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. Then another factor that caused kind of the demise of Jim Crockett Promotions and Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, they wanted to move Starrcade 87 to pay-per-view to face off against Survivor Series and Vince McMahon's Survivor Series, but most cable companies chose Vince McMahon's Survivor Series, because Vince McMahon told the cable companies, you better carry Survivor Series or you're not carrying WrestleMania 4. And cable companies decided to carry Survivor Series because they didn't want to lose WrestleMania 4. And Starrcade 87 was moved from Greensboro, North Carolina to Chicago, Illinois at the UIC Pavilion. And it was an awful pay-per-view card, because they had Ronnie Garvin, who was the NWA World Champion, facing off against Ric Flair, and Ric Flair was in a steel cage match, which Ric Flair was cheered big time. And they also had other matches like the Road Warriors face off against Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard for the NWA World title, but they used a Dusty finish that killed off Chicago for them, and also the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, beat Lex Luger for the U.S. title and stuff like that. But the rest of the card was awful. That left Crockett millions of dollars in debt, and also he had most of his big stars, Jim Crockett Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, like Ric Flair, Lex Luger, and Dusty Rhodes, Arn Anderson, Tully Blanchard, the Rock and Roll Express, fly first class and Lear jets and private limos and other stuff. That was costing Jim Crockett a lot of money. It was, basically bankrupting him. In 1988, they still have great American Bash tours, and also they came up with a concept of Clash of the Champions on TBS, which the first one directly there against WrestleMania 4 on pay-per-view was like their version of Saturday Night's Main Event. It was very successful for TBS, but the attendance at house shows were dropping like crazy because they were having same Dusty finishes all the time for main events, which the fans just eventually stopped coming for because they don't want to see these Dusty finishes a lot. And Jim Crockett Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling was on the verge of bankruptcy and stuff like that, and they needed to be needed something, or they would have folded. And a lot of the talent was getting frustrated. Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard left for the WWF. Also, they had other talent just leave, but they created new talent like Sting and Rick Steiner and a few others. In the fall of 1988, Jim Crockett sold Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling to Turner Broadcasting because TBS carried the NWA Mid-Atlantic for the World Championship Wrestling Saturday Night Show, and also the NWA main event and a couple of other ones, because they wanted wrestling so bad, so they bought it from Jim Crockett, and that effectively ended Jim Crockett promoting wrestling for Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. They still kept the NWA name, but it became WCW, World Championship Wrestling. Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, in my opinion, was a great regional territory, in my opinion. Probably up to par with the WWF at this time and stuff like that. And Jim Crockett Jr. had a lot of great ideas and stuff. He probably was the second biggest wrestling promoter in the country in the 1980s, behind Vince McMahon and stuff. And he's expanded, but I think he just wanted to go too big in acquiring dying regional wrestling territories, which that wasn't that good, because these dying regional wrestling territories didn't have great talent, because most of the talent were either in his organization, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, or the WWF, and also what the UWF thing, which that they blotched that big angle. They got to add an invasion angle, but Jim Crockett wanted to treat it like a B-level show, which was awful. They had some great talent. They could have had Nature Boy Ric Flair face off against Dr. Death Steve Williams in a big feud. Dr. Death was the UWF champion, but he blotched that thing, and he just buried the other talent there, except Sting and Rick Steiner. And also with having all the wrestlers traveling in Lear jets who are like main eventers, and even a lot of mid-carders, that's not good, or private limos, that's breaking the bank and stuff like that. Vince McMahon only had like private jets for like a few of his superstars, like Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage and the Ultimate Warrior, and maybe one or two, but he did not have all the other wrestlers travel regular, and they had to rent cars, not limos. That probably killed him. Plus, moving the operations from Charlotte, North Carolina to Dallas, Texas made no sense whatsoever, because Dallas, Texas is like invading, like in the World Class Championship Wrestling territory, but they got that office building when they acquired the UWF, and also going head to head with the WWF at Survivor Series 1987 Starrcade was the worst idea, because that's losing right off the bat. This was the first time that Jim Crockett promoted a pay-per-view event. He should have waited to do it, or at some other time, but he didn't want to do it. He just wanted to go head-to-head with Vince, and he sold it. It really hurt, because if Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling promoted within the Mid-Atlantic area, and maybe expanded, maybe Baltimore or Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, and maybe as far as west of Chicago, they could still be in business today. But Jim Crockett Jr. really wanted to be up to par with Vince McMahon, but he couldn't do it. Well, that's about it on that. My third and final video blog of the night will be about Splendid Splinter Ted Williams tonight. Have a good day, everybody. Bye now.